Hello to my brilliant students. I just wanted to give you a video tutorial um, of how I am reading the story. I know I've asked you in the past to annotate. Not everybody necessarily understands what annotating means, nor what close reading means. And I'm just going to give you an example of how I read. So, really, what I'm doing is saying out loud what I'm thinking in my head as I start reading the short story that's been assigned to you for this week, which is Jack London's To Build a Fire. So it's just, I guess this is intended, as I said on the slide here, as a way for me to show you how I read for analysis and what I'm thinking about as I read through the beginning of the story. This is how I read for academic reasons. I mean, do I do some of this when I'm reading for pleasure? Of course. But when we read for a class or for academic purposes, or when we know that we're going to be discussing literature with someone else, so maybe you're in a book club, this is, just an example of how to read for those reasons. All right. So in our intro to Build a Fire, I mentioned to you that I wanted you to be on the lookout for certain things while you're reading. Examples of the man versus nature conflict in the story, how the characters and the conflict and the setting all work to propel the plot forward in the story. I wanted you to be on the lookout for imagery, for symbolism. I gave you a clue to be on the lookout for how fire is a symbol in the story. I wanted you to be on the lookout for unknown ideas and terms. Look those up. Don't just skip over them. Look them up if you don't know them. That's how we get smart, right? And then I wanted to be on the lookout for if there's irony or more than one irony that you come across. And then I wanted you to be reading as journalists. So discovering the who, what, when, where, why, and how during this story so that you can, show me what you know, show me your comprehension of the story. All right. So this is the beginning of the story. And I'm just going to read here. And like I said, kind of say out loud what I think in my head as I'm reading. So I'm going to read and then I'm going to be stopping here and there to discuss things. To build a fire. Day had dawned cold and gray when the man turned aside from the main Yukon Trail. He climbed the high earth bank where a little traveled trail led east through the pine forest. It was a high bank and he paused to breathe at the top. He excused the act to himself by looking at his watch. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. There was no sun or promise of sun, although there was not a cloud in the sky. So, as I'm reading through that, images are coming into my mind, that imagery. This author is good at forming pictures in my mind as I read. Day had dawned cold and gray. All right, it's daytime, it's dawn, it's cold, it's gray. I can picture all of those things. The man, I'm looking for a man, turned aside from the main Yukon Trail. Now, that might bring about, um, past knowledge. Do I know anything about the Yukon or the Yukon Trail? If not, maybe I need to learn some things about the Yukon Trail, right? To be able to understand this setting. He climbed the high earth bank where a little traveled trail led east through the pine forest. I can picture a pine forest and a trail, right? It was a high bank, and he paused to breathe at the top. So as he's climbing this, I can understand or imagine him being out of breath. I have been out of breath climbing or hiking before, so I can make that text to self connotation or connection. He looked at his watch, and now I know, oh, it's 9 o'clock in the morning. And there's no sun or promise of sun. That makes me kind of like I put a question mark next to that as I'm reading. What do you mean, no sun? How can there be no sun when it's 9 o'clock in the morning? Well, it's obviously very overcast. No, it says there was not a cloud in the sky. It was a clear day. Okay. This has me a little bit perplexed. However, there seemed to be an indescribable darkness over the face of things. Now, that could have a double meaning. Darkness in terms of literal darkness, like it's not very light out, but it can also be metaphorical, right? Ooh, ominous, right? Darkness over the face of things. A sign that things may not go well. That was because the sun was absent from the sky. Well, we know literally that can't be true, right? If it's daytime, the sun is in the sky somewhere. Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it isn't there. So again, I'm perplexed by how the sun is absent if there's not a cloud in the sky. Is there just a haze because of the cold? I know if it's extremely cold, that can be the case. So that's something I might look up. I might Google something about um, when it's a certain temperature outside, can we not see the sun? Anyway, um, this fact did not worry the man. Okay. He was not alarmed by the lack of sun. It had been days since he had seen the sun. And I made a little note here in my margin, if you will. Maybe this fact should worry the man. The fact that the author means to point out the obvious seems kind of strange to me. The fact did not worry the man. Well, it might worry me. I don't know. I also made a note here. The man turns off the main trail. The man takes a little traveled trail. So, ooh, that alarms me. That worries me for this guy. He got off the main trail and took a little travel trail, meaning a trail that hasn't been worn before. Well, why not? Um, I'm not sure that was a good idea. So let's see. There might be a sense of foreboding here. The man looked along the way he had come. The Yukon lay a mile wide and hidden under 3 feet of ice. Yikes. On top of this ice were as many feet of snow. It was all pure white, north and south. As far as his eye could see, it was unbroken white. The one thing that relieved the whiteness was a thin, dark line that curved from the pine covered island to the south. It curved into the north where it disappeared behind another pine covered island. This dark line was the trail, the main trail. And it already said to us that he went off of the main trail. It led south 500 miles to the Chilkoot Pass and saltwater. It led north 75 miles to Dawson, and still farther on to the north 1,000 miles to Nulato, and finally to St. Michael on Bering Sea, 1,000 miles and a half a thousand more. But all this, the distant trail, no sun in the sky, the great cold, and the strangeness of it all, had no effect on the man. Again, maybe it should? It was not because he was long familiar with it. He was a newcomer in the land, and this was his first winter. Now, what I do when I'm reading for academic purposes, I start taking note of and typing out um, text evidence for things that I think might come up because my teacher told me to be on the lookout for certain things, right? So I know I might as well start collecting text evidence. And so I just do that as I read. It's something that I just, have gotten used to doing over, you know, the many years that I've schooled or been a student. I also do it as a part of my own literary criticism. It's a way for me as a reader to kind of collect my ideas and then have evidence to back up my ideas. So I took from this paragraph two pieces of evidence. One that says, the one thing that relieved the whiteness was a thin, dark line that curved from the pine covered island to the south, ellipsis. The dark line was the trail, the main trail. I feel like that's important. So I made note of that. And then in parentheses, I have the author's last name, comma, and then the page number. And then parentheses and the period goes outside of that. That's something to make note of too. That's the correct MLA citation. But all this, ellipsis, had no effect on the man. It was not because he was long familiar with it. He was a newcomer. I felt like that was important enough to note. All right. The trouble with him was that he was not able to imagine. And I made a note below. It's really important that we take notice when an author, an omniscient third person narrator, includes a line such as, the trouble with him was, it's like, oh, another one of these that we always want to take note of is, little did he know. It's like, oh, okay. The author is definitely pointing something out for us here. The trouble with him was, all right, so we know that there's going to be trouble for this guy. The trouble with him that he was not able to imagine. He was quick and ready in the things of life, but only in the things and not in their meanings. That's important in this. 50 degrees below zero meant 80 degrees of frost. Such facts told him that it was cold and uncomfortable, and that was all. It did not lead him to consider his weaknesses as a creature affected by temperature, nor did he think about man's general weakness, able to live only within narrow limits of heat and cold. Very true, very human quality that we are only able to live within a certain narrow limit of heat and cold. I'll let you decide for yourself what that narrow limit is. How hot can we stand it? How cold can we stand it? From there, it did not lead him to thoughts of heaven and the meaning of a man's life. So he's not a deep thinker, right? He's not thinking about the meaning of life. He's just thinking about the facts. 50 degrees below zero meant a bite of frost that hurt and that must be guarded against by the use of mittens. Well, I would hope so, ear coverings, warm moccasins, and thick socks. 50 degrees below zero was to him nothing more than 50 degrees below zero. That it should be more important than that was a thought that never entered his head. Ooh, alarm, 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 ding, 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 right? A thought that it should be more important than that was a thought that never entered his head. Ooh, that's troublesome and foreboding for sure. Um, and then this is the same paragraph, but it was full of things, so I made another slide of it. I want us to, and I've got here up in the dotted line box here, please pay attention to how facts and knowledge work in tandem with one another, but also are opposed to one another in this story. That's important. So, introduced here is the idea that the power and awe of nature should be. This guy doesn't realize it, but the author is pointing out to us that nature, the power and awe of nature, is more important than just the facts about nature. And it's pointed out that 50 degrees below zero should be important to a human being. Might not be important to this guy, but we need to understand as the reader that is more important. Just seeing something, on a thermometer is one thing, but understanding the danger that that presents is important in this story. As he turned to go, he forced some water from his mouth as an experiment. There was a sudden noise that surprised him. He tried it again. And again, in the air before they could fall to the snow, the drops of water became ice that broke with a noise. Y'all, have you ever been where it's that cold? If you spit, it freezes and cracks and breaks before it hits the ground. Holy cow, that is cold. He knew that at 50 below zero, water from the mouth made a noise when it hit the snow. But this had done that in the air. Undoubtedly, it was colder than 50 below. But exactly how much colder he did not know. But the temperature did not matter. Wait a second. What? Yes, it does. The temperature did not matter. Of course it matters. He was headed for the old camp on Henderson Creek. All right. So I like alarm bells went off big time and I put like a caution triangle here and I wrote, uh-oh, that is important. And then I also made note of this part on page 65 by making an in-text citation. Undoubtedly, it was colder than 50 below, but exactly how much colder he did not know. But the temperature did not matter. Methinks it will matter. And I also get kind of silly when I um, converse. I do. I like ask questions of the text when I'm reading. I make notes of it. I make silly emojis. And so, I have fun with the text while I'm reading. He was headed for the old camp on Henderson Creek where the boys were ready. We don't know who the boys are, but we're guessing it's, um, again, my background knowledge is that he is uh, in the Yukon Trail, likely meeting up with some gold miners. This is the Klondike Gold Rush. They had come across the mountain from the Indian Creek country. He had taken the long trail to look at the possibility of floating logs from the islands in the Yukon down the river when the ice melted. He would be in camp by 6 o'clock that evening. It would be a little after dark, but the boys would be there. A fire would be burning, and a hot supper would be ready. Well, that's something to look forward to, right? As he thought of lunch, he pressed his hand against the package under his jacket. It was also under his shirt, wrapped in a handkerchief, and laying for warmth against the naked skin. Otherwise, the bread would freeze. He smiled contentedly to himself as he thought of those pieces of bread, each of which enclosed a generous portion of cooked meat. He plunged among the big pine trees. The trail was not well marked here. Several inches of snow had fallen since the last sled had passed. He was glad he was without a sled. Actually, he carried nothing but the lunch wrapped in the handkerchief. He was surprised, however, at the cold. It certainly was cold, he decided, as he rubbed his nose and face with his mittened hand. He had a good growth of hair on his face, but that did not protect his nose or the upper part of his face from the frosty air. Uh-oh. So, on the one hand, I understand that he is glad that he packed light, that he doesn't have, a toboggan to pull because that's just more work to do. But on the other hand, I'm thinking, well, maybe it would have been a good idea to pack a sled with maybe some shelter, some warm and dry extra clothing, maybe some extra food and water. So, yeah, I'm on the one hand, I understand packing light. On the other hand, I think maybe it would be nice to have some provisions with me, and it might be worth pulling a sled to have those provisions to fall back on. I'm a hiker and a camper, and so for me, not having gear with me is sort of alarming. All right. I mentioned that we were going to be talking about instincts that are separate from knowledge. So here comes up some examples of that. Following at the man's heels was a big native dog. It was a wolf dog, gray coated and not noticeably different from its brother, the wild wolf. So we can, again, here's this imagery. We can picture what this dog looks like, right? Gray coat, looks like a wild wolf. I'm thinking maybe a husky looking, a big native dog to me. I don't know. I'm thinking in the Yukon. All right, it's probably a husky or a Malamute or something like that. The animal was worried by the great cold. Hmm, interesting. Okay. It knew that this was no time for traveling. Its own feeling was closer to the truth than the man's judgment. In reality, it was not merely colder than 50 below zero, it was colder than 60 below, then 70 below. It was 75 below zero. Holy cow, y'all. Think Fahrenheit degrees, 75 below. Schools close here if it's 20 below. So, wow, 75 below zero. It's sort of unimaginable because the freezing point is 32 above zero. It meant that there were 107 degrees of frost. The dog did not know anything about temperatures, possibly in its brain. There was there was no understanding of a condition of very cold, such as was in the man's brain, but the animal sensed the danger. Its fear made it question eagerly every movement of the man, as if expecting him to go into camp or to seek shelter somewhere and build a fire. Yeah, like, duh. Our instincts would be get out of the cold, get out of the cold, right? Go find shelter, go build a fire. So the dog's instincts are actually um, makes more sense, right? The dog had learned about fire and it wanted fire. Otherwise, it would dig itself into the snow and find shelter from the cold air. So here's this idea of the dog's instincts make more sense than the man's understanding of cold, right? And so again, I made a note. I made an in-text citation here. The animal was worried by the great cold. It knew that this was no time for traveling. Its own feeling was closer to the truth than the man's judgment. And so I made note of that. And then I made myself a little chart down here: man versus dog, the man's judgment, the man's brain, understanding versus the dog that, is instinctual. It senses danger. It had learned about fire. It wants fire. It knew instinctually that it was no time for traveling. The frozen moistness of its breathing had settled on its fur in a fine powder of frost. The hair on the man's face was similarly frosted, but more solidly. It took the form of ice and increased with every warm, moist breath from his mouth. Also, the man had tobacco in his mouth. The ice held his lips so tightly together that he could not empty the juice from his mouth. The result was a long piece of yellow ice hanging from his lips. If he fell down, it would break like glass into many pieces. He expected the ice formed by the tobacco juice, having been out twice before when it was very cold. But it had not been as cold as this, he knew. Again, ooh, ding, ding, ding. He's never been out in this kind of cold. He continued through the level forest for several miles. Then he went down a bank to the frozen path of a small stream. This was Henderson Creek, and he knew he was 10 miles from where the stream divided. He looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. He was traveling at the rate of 4 miles an hour. Thus he figured that he would arrive where the stream divided at 12:30. He decided he would eat his lunch when he arrived there. All right. I just made a note here in italics that I made a text to life connection here. And I did kind of chuckle to myself thinking about, yeah, he's got these plans of, oh, if I'm traveling this far, it seems like he's got everything computed for himself. And I laugh because of how many times I have planned an adventure. Like I said, I'm a camper and a hiker, and I've planned things down to the last minute. And I think, and I laugh to myself about how infrequently that has worked for me. Um, it almost seems like life plays a joke on me, right? The more I plan things down to the last minute, the more things go awry. So I made that text to life connection. The dog followed again at his heels, with its tail hanging low as the man started to walk along the frozen stream. The old sled trail could be seen, but a dozen inches of snow covered the marks of the last sleds. In a month, no man had traveled up or down that silent creek. Ooh, wow, no one's been there for a month. The man went steadily ahead. He was not much of a thinker. Well, okay. At that moment, he had nothing to think about except that he would eat lunch at the stream's divide and that at 6 o'clock he would be in camp with the boys. There was nobody to talk to, and had there been, speech would not have been possible because of the ice around his mouth. Once in a while, the thought repeated itself that it was very cold and that he had never experienced such cold. As he walked along, he rubbed his face and nose with the back of his mittened hand. He did this without thinking, frequently changing hands. But with all his rubbing, the instant he stopped, his face and nose became numb. His face would surely be frozen. He knew that, and he was sorry that he had not worn the sort of nose guard Bud wore when it was cold. We don't know who Bud is, but we're guessing it's one of the boys that he keeps talking about. Such a guard passed across the nose and covered the entire face. So I did make note that he said he was sorry he had not worn the sort of nose guard Bud wore when it was cold. So already he's having some regrets, right? He probably should have brought a nose guard. But it did not matter much, he decided. What was a little frost? A bit painful, that was all. It was never serious. Oh boy, I don't know. Makes me wonder. It was never serious. Well, methinks it's going to be serious. Empty as the man's mind was of thoughts, he was most observant. He noticed the changes in the creek, the curves, and the bends, and always he noted where he placed his feet. Once, coming around a bend, he moved suddenly to the side like a frightened horse. He curved away from the place where he had been walking and retraced his steps several feet along the trail. He knew the creek was frozen to the bottom. No creek could contain water in that winter. But he also knew there were streams of water that came out from the hillsides and ran along under the snow and on top of the ice of the creek. He knew that even in the coldest weather, these streams were never frozen, and he also knew their danger. They hid pools of water under the snow that might be 3 inches deep or 3 feet. Sometimes a skin of ice half an inch thick covered them, and in turn was covered by the snow. Sometimes there was both water and thin ice, and when a man broke through, he could get very wet. That was why he had jumped away so suddenly. He had felt the ice move under his feet. He had also heard the noise of the snow covered ice skin breaking. And to get his feet wet in such a temperature meant trouble and danger. At the very least, it meant delay, because he would be forced to stop and build a fire. Only under its protection could he bare his feet while he dried his socks and moccasins. All right, there's some of our first. Well, we've seen it a couple times, but I told you to be on the lookout for the symbol of fire. And if I were reading here, and like actually had a little book in front of me, I might start highlighting the word fire, because I feel like it might be important. And maybe I would put like an orange circle around fire or something so that I could easily look back at it. But I know fire has come up in the past as well. Um, and it might be a good idea to start making note of that. I know it was part when the dog was mentioned. Here's one. Anyway, sometimes I think it's important to just kind of keep track of where I keep seeing words repeated. And I know the dog wanted a fire, remember? Anyway, that's something that I also do is just kind of keep track where I keep seeing certain things that are symbolic or repeated. I keep track of that. During the next 2 hours, he came to several similar dangers. Usually, the snow above the pools had a sunken appearance. However, once again, he came near to falling through the ice. Once, sensing danger, he made the dog go ahead. The dog did not want to go. It hesitated until the man pushed it forward. I don't know about y'all, but I instantly feel bad for the dog. I'm like, no, don't make the dog go. I don't know. I'm a sucker for dogs. Then it went quickly across the white, unbroken surface. Suddenly, it fell through the ice, but climbed out on. Ah, the old head here in the way. But climbed out on the other side, which was firm. It had wet its feet and legs. We're like, no, don't get wet, doggy, doggy, doggy. Almost immediately, the water on them turned to ice. The dog made quick efforts to get the ice off its legs. Then it lay down in the snow and began to bite out the ice that had formed between the toes. Any of you who have dogs, especially dogs who have like those furry pads on their feet, um, have seen their dogs do this before. The animal knew enough to do this. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being. Hello, instinct, right? A dog doesn't make mental note of, oh, I know that if I don't, remove this ice from between my feet, I will get sore feet. It doesn't think like a doctor, right? It thinks instinctually, it knows this. The animal knew enough to bite out the ice between its toes. To permit the ice to remain would mean sore feet. It did not know this. It merely obeyed the commands that arose from the deepest part of its being. I made note of that from the text so that, um, if I need to answer a question later, I've got that text evidence ready to go. All right. I wanted to keep this to a half hour, and it is 30 minutes and 26 seconds. So I'm going to end here. And hopefully, this gave you a little bit of an idea of how to read closely and to pick up on certain things about the story to this point. I will meet with you again soon.